This short video is going to talk about how we can use outside information in order to help us interpret a text better. So you should have already looked at the video about close reading that goes through the different formal and stylistic elements of the story of an hour. If you haven't read the story of an hour and you haven't taken the time to analyze it for formal and stylistic elements, go ahead and pause this video so that you can do that now. As we go through, feel free to pause the video whenever you need to take notes or to review information. But this video is going to talk about how we can use outside information in our interpretations. I want to be really clear though, you can do an interpretation just based on formal or stylistic elements. A formal analysis or a close reading, sometimes called new criticism, is always where you need to start. It doesn't really matter what you know outside of a text if you haven't paid attention to the actual words on the page. But sometimes a historical analysis is necessary to understand the context of a story. We might look at an author's life, their other works, or even the setting of the story, the poem, or the play in order to better understand what's actually going on. A lot of this information is easy to find online. It's easy to Google. But again, you really need to focus on the words on the page first. So if you haven't done those analysis steps of going through the formal elements, looking at stylistic elements, then none of the other stuff really matters. So go ahead and do that first. Okay, let's take a look at the author's life. But before we do that, I want to make a quick note about authorial intention. It used to be 100 years ago that when we talked about interpreting a text, what we were trying to do is figure out what the author intended. Understanding an author's life can help you figure out what a story might be arguing, but in the end, we now know that really the reading process is part of what creates the story and the story experience. In the end, the story always belongs to the reader. So I'll give you an example of this. Mark Twain, he wanted to write an anti-slavery book. So when he wrote The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, his intention was to create a book that would show the horrors of slavery so that people would really understand what a terrible institution this was. The only problem is that book uses the N-word 208 times, and it is not a long book. So maybe Twain meant to write a pro-abolition book, an anti-slavery book, but the book itself reveals itself to be deeply racist just in the language it uses. So whatever his intention might have been, a modern reader's experience of encountering that book might be completely different, and it actually might undermine the author's intention. And that's fine. That's part of interpretation, because remember, interpretation is always an argument. It's always making a claim, providing reasons, and showing evidence for why your reasons are correct. So what an author intends and what a book does to or for a reader can be different, and you can make an argument that whatever the author intended, the book is actually doing something else. The poem is actually doing something else. So let's learn a little bit about Kate Chopin. Kate Chopin was born in the middle of the 19th century, 1850, and she died in 1904, so at the turn of the 20th century. She was raised Roman Catholic, and in her lifetime, she wrote hundreds of short stories and 2 novels, most of which are set in Louisiana, where she lived. Most of these focus on the lives of sensitive and intelligent women, and she's often considered the forerunner of feminist writers. So in terms of her life, she married Oscar Chopin in 1870, and they moved to New Orleans, where she had 6 children between the years of 1871 and 1879. Oscar died about 2 years later in 1882, which left her a widow with 6 children and $42,000 in debt. So to give you kind of an estimate, that's about $420,000 of debt in the 21st century, if we account for inflation. So this means that she has to figure out a way to survive. So she moves back to St. Louis to live with her mother, and she starts writing as therapy, in part after her mother's death, but in part because she could sell her work. By the 1890s, she's writing stories that sold to popular magazines. And at this time, a great way for a writer to make a living is to sell your stories in magazines. There's no television, there's no YouTube shorts at this time. People for entertainment read magazines. So magazines could pay quite a lot for a short story in ways that they don't today. And you could actually get paid better for short stories in magazines at that time than by writing novels. So she's writing her short stories in magazines. By 1899, she published her first novel, The Awakening, which kind of launched her onto the scene, in part because of the negative press. In The Awakening, it ends very tragically with the main character kind of walking out into the sea because she can see no other sense and way to live. And the general press did not love this, right? This was a very negative portrayal of women. So much of Chopin's work focuses on the struggles of women in the late 19th century, but Chopin herself didn't see herself as a feminist. She was not a suffragist. She was a woman who took women seriously and never doubted women's ability to be strong, but she wouldn't have identified herself the way that we currently identify her. And that's another one of those examples of how an author's perspective on their own work might not be as relevant as our reading of that work. So Chopin's sympathies often focus on the individual in the face of society's pressures and confines, and she's especially interested in women. So when Chopin tried to publish The Story of an Hour in 1894, many publications thought it was too radical or even immoral. And this was in part because of how women were positioned in Victorian society. So at the end of the 19th century, women were really strictly defined by their gender roles. Women were expected to be fragile, feminine, and dependent. They were seen as inferior to men. And the choices for women were basically, you could get married, you could be a spinster, or you're a whore. That's it. That is really your only options. You're either kind of married off to a man and then you're the man's property. You are the poor unmarried relation who is dependent on your brothers, uncles, fathers for support, or you operate outside of the realm of what's morally acceptable. You are the whore. Even if you're not an actual prostitute, that's how you're viewed. So in Victorian society, and this is something that Story of an Hour really kind of deals with, marriage works very differently than it does today. So in a Victorian society, the legal institution of marriage, two became one, literally and legally. That means that a woman belonged to her husband. She was not seen as a separate citizen. This was the biggest rationale why women did not need the right to vote, is because they were one entity. So why should one entity get two votes? So legally, a wife owed obedience to her husband, and legally, husbands were responsible for their wives. You can imagine, though, how that plays out in reality. It's very difficult at this time for a woman to bring a suit against her husband. And actually, women could not divorce their husband at all, except for adultery, which was very, very difficult to prove. So this is the world in which Kate Chopin is writing in, and these are the issues that she is aware of, that she's kind of submersed in, and that she lives her life with as she's writing Story of an Hour. And you're going to see some of these kind of pop up in the text. So when we think of Mrs. Mallard and how she reacts to her husband's death, we can't really judge her based on 21st century standards because she's not a 21st century woman in a 21st century marriage. She's a woman in a Victorian marriage who has no other options until she's widowed. So I hope this was a little bit informative about some of the outside information for Story of an Hour. I'll have another video kind of putting it all together, showing how you can use formal elements and also kind of outside information in order to make arguments of interpretation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out and ask.